Big day for us today because we're about to start the fourth chapter of Pirkei Avos. So a new chapter, new beginning, new opportunity, new learning. It's something that we should obviously use to the best of our abilities. It's a very interesting Mishnah, by the way. There's a few of the commentaries point out that each Mishnah that introduces a new chapter is selected to introduce that chapter because it speaks about something that is quite universal. So certain of the Mishnahs will focus on very specific messages, and certain of the Mishnahs will touch on broad universal issues. This is a very universal message, this particular Mishnah. So that's just important to bear in mind as we go into what we're going to learn today, is that we're not just learning something detailed, we're learning something that speaks in a certain sense to the essence of what it means to be a human being. So that's interesting. Before we do that, though, let's first find out who the author is of this particular Mishnah. The author is an individual whose name is Ben Zoima. That's how he is referred to in the Mishnah, Ben Zoima. Now that's interesting. Why don't we call the individual by his name? You know, why are we calling him by his father's name? Ben Zoima, the son of Zoima. We don't necessarily even know who Zoima was. You know, why is that the individual's name? Why is that the way that the Torah is referring to him? So that's one of the first things we're going to look at. It's just the personality. And what we're going to discover, very interestingly, is that Ben Zoima is one of four rabbis who lived at around about the same time. Just to give you the chronology, the historical placement, they lived at the time just around the destruction of the second temple, the second Beis HaMikdash. Ben Zoima, the author of our Mishnah, was a student of the great Rabbi Yoshua ben Hanania. And these four individuals all shared the same first name. So according to some of the commentaries, the reason that they were not called by their first name was to actually distinguish between these four rabbis who all lived at the same time. One is Ben Zoima. One is Ben Azai. One is Ben Nanes. And the third one is the one who gives us the clue as to what their first names were. They all shared the name Shimon, and the fourth one was called Shimon Hatemoni. So three of them were named after their father because they all obviously studied together. They were all in the same place at the same time. It's a little like going to a Chabad school and, you say, can I please speak to Mendy? So, there's obviously a few of them going around. So in those days, I guess, there were these four Rabbi Shimons who all lived at the same time. So to distinguish between them, they dropped the first name, and they called three of them after their fathers, Ben Zoima, Ben Azai, Ben Nanas, and one of them after the region where he came from, Shimon HaTeimani. Shimon, I guess we're translated today as the Yemenite. Now that's interesting. It doesn't necessarily give us the full picture, because there are surely other ways that you could distinguish between people who have a similar name without dropping their title and without dropping their name altogether. So there's got to be more to the story. Why is this Rabbi Shimon ben Zoima only referred to as Ben Zoima? And so when you do a little bit more historical research, you're going to find some very interesting things. First thing that you're going to find is that he became a very great scholar at a very young age. In fact, he was such a great scholar, and this is relevant to what he's going to teach us. He was such a great scholar that when he passed away, the Gemara tells us at the end of Soita that when Ben Zoima passed away, Batlu Hadarshonim, people who had the ability to really expound the Torah in the way that is called Drush, they stopped. He was the last of the great Darshonim. Now, that's a little foreign to us because in our world today, when you hear the word drosha, what do you think of when you hear the word drosha? You think of the sermon, right? The rabbi's sermon. And you think, well, obviously he's got the ability to speak, but what's the great power and wonder, Batlo Hadarshonim. So the implication over here is that a darshan was somebody who knew how to mine the words of the Torah for their fullest content, not just somebody who get up and make a nice sermon in the modern context, with a bit of a joke at the beginning and a nice conclusion at the end. And most people will tell you, please God, not too much time in between the beginning and the end. That's what makes a good sermon. But a darshan in those days, that was somebody who really knew how to take a verse, to take a principle out of Torah, and to really expound on it in a deep, deep way. So Ben Zoima was this outstanding darshan. And because he achieved such fame at such a young age, that's why he's called Ben Zoima. to allude to the fact that when he became famous and when he became a great scholar in Israel, he was still young, he was still a junior, like his father was, so to speak, the generation of the great scholars at the time. So he was called Ben Zoima. Another interesting historical fact about him is that while Ben Zoima was such a great scholar, you must remember that at that time in Israel, remember that this is Jews living in Israel during the temple period, or in Ben Zoma's case, the time of the destruction of the temple. And the greatest accolade that you could get, the greatest title that you could get as a rabbi was smicha. Now, for us today, smicha means that somebody goes to a yeshiva and they study certain subjects, and at the end of the subjects, they get a certificate, and the certificate says, yoire, that this individual now has the right to render halachic decisions. And effectively, that means that you've learned certain areas of Jewish law. Smicha in those days meant that your teacher would have conveyed this official authority on you as a link in the unbroken chain of tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu. And then you'd carry the title Rabbi, like Rabbi Akiva or Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. And it could only be conveyed in Israel. This smicha could only be conveyed in Israel. Unfortunately for Ben Zoima, he never had the opportunity to receive smicha from his teacher, from Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. And to highlight the fact that he lost the opportunity to get smicha, he's never referred to, not only is he not referred to as Rabbi Shimon, he's not even referred to by his name. Why didn't he get smicha? That's the question you have to ask yourself. Why did he not get smicha? And the answer to that is because he unfortunately had an incident where he was harmed. It was a spiritual incident with spiritual nuclear fallout. And as a result of that, he passed away at a young age. That's why he didn't really have the opportunity to attain smicha. What was the incident? So the Gemara tells us that there were 4 great sages, and the 4 great sages entered into what is called pardes. Pardes means an orchard, but it is code that the rabbis use when they want to refer to something that is deeply, deeply mystical. And so he was one of the 4 sages together with Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai and Elisha ben Avuya, and they went into this deep, deep mystical experience, and unfortunately it harmed him. And as a result of that, to illustrate the fact that he ended his career at a very young age, that's why his name is not used. Okay, Ben Zoima. On the other hand, you have to realize that this is something that tells us that he must have been a very great individual, because not just anybody could have entered that mystical realm. So we now have 2 pieces of evidence that both tell us that Ben Zoima was a very great person. When he passed away, they said that's the end of Darashanim, people who can really expound the Torah in the way that it should be expounded. And the second thing is that he's one of the unique 4 personalities who went into this paradise, into this deep, deep mystical space. And even though he wasn't, unfortunately, able to bring it home, he wasn't able to translate the experience into real life, and it kind of fried his circuits. But the bottom line is, he was able to go there in the first place. So what will Ben Zoima teach us? Like I mentioned, the opening Mishnah of a chapter in Pirkei Avos typically addresses a universal issue. And so he's going to address a universal issue. The universal issue is, what do people look for in life? It's a great question. It's one of those things that if you can get it right, you'll start a business that's going to make a lot of money, right? Because if you know what people are looking for and you find a way to provide it, that's the most guaranteed way to make a success of your livelihood. So what do people want in life? What are people looking for in life? That's the question, the burning question that Ben Zoima wants to address. And not only is he going to address the question from the perspective of what are people looking for in their life, but he's going to take it a level deeper than that and say there are many, many things that people want in their lives. And many of those things that people want are not necessarily things that actually add value to the person. So his entire perspective over here is going to be, let's look at what are the 4 key things that people look for in life, and let's try and find how and why these are things that add value to a person, as opposed to just adding things to the person's laundry list. So I'm pretty sure at some point in your life, you open up your cupboards at home, you look inside and say, where did all this stuff come from? Because those are the things that don't necessarily add value to your life. They add to your life. They add sometimes clutter to your life. They add sometimes pleasure to your life. But what adds value to you as a person, that's really what Ben Zoima is most interested in. And so he's going to tackle the 4 primary areas that people are interested in. People, and it depends who you are, right? Because different people tend to focus on different things. So there are people in this world who, for them, the greatest achievement, the greatest thing that they want to have in life is wisdom. That already tells you that we're dealing with somebody who's a little bit more advanced as a human being. That's right. Here we're talking about a person who values something that may not be so tangible, wisdom. But at the end of the day, wisdom is, as the expression goes, Reishis Chochma. It's the beginning of everything is wisdom. So that's one kind of a person. Then we're going to see that there's a different kind of person. Some people, what they value is power. And we have to analyze exactly what motivates that. Is that some kind of an inflated ego? Is it because the person enjoys being dominant over other people? Or is there actually a value in power? So we have to think about that. But it's quite typical that there are many people in this world who look for power, whether it be political power, or whether it be influence over a social group, or whether it be power within the community. Some people are driven by power. Then we're going to discover that some people are driven by wealth. That's what they want. They want to be wealthy. I think it'd probably be fair to say that in today's world, that's a very commonplace drive, yes? People want to be wealthy. And everybody's trying to work so hard in order to make money, to be able to live in a way that they envisage that they should be able to live. So the question there is also, is that an accolade? Is that a value? If a person has wealth, is that an actual value, or is that just an accumulation of assets? And it's a very interesting question, because when a person, for example, accumulates wisdom, you can tell me that the person has changed. But when a person accumulates wealth, doesn't necessarily mean that the person has actually moved, that the person has actually grown, that the person has actually become somebody better. In fact, unfortunately, sometimes it's actually the other way around. And the last thing he's going to speak about is that some people look for fame, honor, respect. In fact, I once heard from an older man, I thought it was an interesting observation. He said, if you have a look basically through the course of a person's life, the temptation that a person is drawn towards has different stages in their life. So when a person is young, what are the temptations that a person has when they're young? They want things to play with and things that are sweet to eat. That's basically what kids want, right? They want toys, flashy toys, and things that are full of sugar. When you get a little bit older, a person hits their teens, so then the temptation that people have is around relationships and about the pleasure associated with relationships. Eventually, a person reaches a point in their life where they start to become tempted after wealth. That's really what they want, to be able to create a big asset base and a legacy and all that kind of thing. And he said to me, this particular individual, an older man, he said the ultimate Yetzer Hara, the ultimate temptation that people reach in life is when they reach a stage where all they want is honor. It was quite a fascinating insight. In other words, the person reaches the point that the physical pleasures of this world don't necessarily do what they used to do for them. And the wealth isn't necessarily so attractive. So what do they want? They want people to give them honor and respect. It's a very fascinating psychology, and it fits very well with this Mishnah. So let's take a look. Basically, what Ben Zoma is going to do for us is he's going to offer 4 suggestions, one for each of these particular interests that people tend to have in life. And each of those 4 suggestions is almost the exact opposite, if not the exact opposite, of the conventional understanding of these 4 things. Okay, so let's have a look. Let's see what he has to say and how he effectively flips everything on its head and says, it's not what people think. Ben Zoma Oimer. Ben Zoma says, Eizehu Chacham. Who is a wise person? Haloimed Mikol Adam. Somebody who learns from every person. Now, what you're going to see as a theme throughout this entire Mishnah is that he does not say who has wisdom, or who has wealth, or who has power. He specifically says who is wise, who is strong, who is wealthy. Now, there's a very big difference between saying somebody has wisdom, saying that they are wise. Because you can only really apply a title to somebody when they have mastered a particular area of life. So, for example, you could say somebody has medical knowledge, or you could say somebody is a doctor. Big difference. Big difference, right? I don't know if you saw the suggestion that was going around from one of the hospitals, because hospitals obviously have been under so much stress, during this whole COVID period. So one of the hospitals, because they were under financial distress, they suggested that what they're going to do is they're going to get rid of some of their medical staff and replace them with Jewish mothers who've read things on Google. So that's the difference between somebody who has medical knowledge and somebody who is a doctor. That's exactly what Ben Zoma wants to say. What is the difference between somebody who has wisdom and somebody who is wise? Between somebody who has strength and someone who is strong. Someone who has money and someone who is wealthy. Somebody who gets honor and someone who is honored. Now, the minute you start to put it into those terms, straight away you can see that he's actually talking about a very different kind of an experience to what people typically expect. So, Ezehu Chacham, who is the wise person? Haloimed mikol adam. The definition of a wise person is somebody who learns from every person. It's an incredible thought, and we're going to obviously look at it in greater detail. It's an incredible thought, somebody who learns from every person. So we'll have to understand, why is that the symbol of a wise person? Now, in each of these four cases, he's going to bring a verse from somewhere in Tanakh back to verify this particular approach. Here he quotes King David in Tehillim. Shenemar, King David says, Mikol melamdai hiskalti. From all of my teachers, I have become more wise. Hiskalti from the word seichel. So I've developed greater seichel from all of my teachers. And the implication of the word kol, all, implies that they were not necessarily people who were qualified formally to be teachers, all people who taught him. And then he continues, Ki eidvoisecha sichali, because Hashem, your testimony is my conversation. Now we're going to have to wonder, why is that part of the proof? We get it. King David says, I have learned from everybody who taught me. That obviously fits with what Ben Zoma is saying, that a wise person learns from everybody. Why does it bring on the second point about this eidos, that there's some kind of testimony that is part of the wisdom that he had gathered? Okay, we have to understand that. Then he says, Ezehu Gibor, who is a powerful person. Hakovesh es Yitzray, somebody who is able to conquer his or her own temptation, their own impulses. Anybody can control their own impulses. That is what we call a powerful person. This he proves from a quotation from King Solomon. Shenemar, where King Solomon says, Shlomo HaMelech says, Toiv erech hapayim migibor. Better the person who is patient than the person who is strong. Umoishel beruchoi. And the person who is in charge, in control of his spirit, which basically means his impulse, is better than a person who conquers a city. There again, we're going to have to see, why do we need the two parts of this pasuk? The one part surely gives the message. If you have patience, that's better than being strong. What's he adding to that by saying, and the person who can control his own temptation or impulse is better than somebody who conquers a city? Ezehu Oshir, who is wealthy, says, the Pirkei Avos says, Ben Zoma hasomeach bechelkoi, one of the most mistranslated phrases out of the entire Talmud. How does everybody translate it? Who is rich? He who is satisfied with his lot. The word sameach does not mean satisfied. Sameach means joyful. Sameach is like a simcha. What's a simcha? A simcha is an expression of some milestone event in a person's life that generates so much joy that sometimes you actually can't stop yourself from dancing. You certainly can't stop yourself from smiling, right? It's just so powerful. It's so overwhelming. Who is wealthy? The person who has joy in their personal portion. Means whatever they have in their life gives them joy. Again over here he quotes from Tehillim Shenemar, because the pasuk says, Yegia kapecha ki seichel, if you eat the product of your own hand, ashrecha v'toivlach, then you will be happy and it will be good for you. Now in this case, Ben Zoma actually explains what the pasuk means. Ashrecha ba'olam hazeh, you will be happy in this world. That's what he's saying. The asher is samech bechelkai, that the person who's really wealthy, if they can be happy, if they can celebrate, they can find joy in what they have. And what does it mean? It will also be good for you in addition to the fact that you'll be happy. That is lo olam haba, that refers to the world to come. Lastly, he concludes Ezehu mechubad, who is a person that is honored. Hamechabed es habrios, somebody who gives honor to others. And the word choice over here is very specific, because brios, we might remember, all the way from the first chapter. Remember the first chapter, we had Hillel teach us that you should be a student of Aaron. And what does it mean to be a student of Aaron? That you should love the brios. And then we explain, what does it mean to love the brios? Brios translates as creatures. So there are some people in our, sadly, some people in our environment, you look at them and you think, what does this person actually have as a value? What do they bring to the table? What do they add to the world? And then you realize, well, Hashem created them, so surely that gives them some kind of value. That's the kind of person Hillel said that you should love. This is the kind of person that Ben Zomer says you should honor. And this he learns, Shenema, this he learns from a pasuk in the book of Shmuel, where Hashem says, Ki mechabdai achabed, those who honor me, I will honor. Uvoizai yekolu, and those who disgrace me, they will become like nothing. They'll become insignificant. Okay, so these are the four things. Basically, if you have a look at it at face value, what he's telling us, Ben Zomer, over here is that the wisdom of Judaism is the opposite of conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom says, who's a wise person? A wise person. That's who everybody else goes to learn from. The wise person is a teacher, obviously. And yet, Ben Zomer says, well, the truth be told, it's the other way around. A truly wise person is a student, a universal student, a student for the long term. Somebody who consistently learns, and doesn't just consistently learn, but learns specifically from every person. Conventional wisdom says, who is powerful? Powerful! Somebody who can exert their power over other people. That's who's powerful. They can control other people, they can conquer lands, they can run a business. That's who's powerful. Torah wisdom says the exact opposite. You know what? Sometimes people who exert their strength over others actually have lack of power. Who is truly powerful? Person who can control themselves. And we're going to visit each of these in greater detail. According to conventional wisdom, what is wealth? Wealth is where you can buy things that nobody else can buy. And you could do things that nobody else could afford to do. So therefore, the headspace, the psychology of wealth in a conventional sense is you're always looking for more. As the Gemara says, Mi sheyesh lo moneh, roitze mosayim. Any person who has 100, in those days the currency was zuz, they naturally now want 200 zuz. That's human nature. That's what the conventional wisdom calls wealth. That's not wealth. That's lack. Because you're constantly aware of what you don't have. Whereas what Ben Zomer says is wealth is whatever you have, not only are you satisfied with it, but your life is filled with joy because of what you have. And lastly, the conventional wisdom says that a person who is honored, how do you know somebody's honored? Look around, you'll see these are the people that everybody gives honor to. These are the people who have 4 million followers on Instagram. These are the people who are on the front pages of the news. These are the people that are on the silver screen. That's who is honored. Says Ben Zomer, that's nonsense. That doesn't mean a thing, and we'll analyze why. Real honor is when a person extends honor to other people. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of these and try and understand them, what exactly the deeper message is. But it all falls on a verse, a pasuk, in the book of Yirmiyahu that says, Al yisalel ha'chocham b'chochmasoi, v'al yisalel ha'gibor b'gvurasoi, v'al yisalel ha'asher b'ashroi, that a person who is wise should not become full of themselves because they're wise, and a person who is powerful should not become full of themselves because they're powerful, and a person who is wealthy should not become full of themselves because they're wealthy. Ki im bezoi sisalel ha'misalel. So what should a person take pride in? Haskel v'yodoya oisi. Hashem says any person who applies their mind to try to know me, that is a worthwhile pursuit. And that kind of sits at the core of all of this. Because let's start with wisdom first of all. There are two different kinds of wisdom that exist. And you would have known this from personal experience because you've probably met people like this. Some people are wise and they know it. And that is always painful. It's always painful to be in the room with somebody who knows that they're smart. Because it's like ugly, Why do you have to make a big deal about yourself that you know that you're smart? And you know what's interesting about history? History will record in every single sphere. It could be as simple as predicting the weather. It could be as serious as economists or politicians or scientists. Smart people are the ones who make the worst mistakes. It's a fact. Smart people make the worst mistakes. Why? Because they're so smart. Because they believe that they know. Because they've done the research. That's why doctors, unfortunately, make serious medical misdiagnoses. Why? Because they're so smart. Remember once upon a time, there used to be the good old-fashioned family GP used to do house calls. Remember there's such a thing called house calls? Does anybody remember this? There used to be a thing called house calls, and the doctor used to come in his little black bag. Remember that? I don't know about what was in that black bag. Not a whole lot. It was like a stethoscope and some of those sticks, those lollies. I don't know what they had in those bags, right? That doctor made far fewer mistakes in diagnosis than our fancy, super specialized people with all kinds of technology for one simple reason. You know why? Because he knew who you were. You weren't just patient number X. He knew who you were. And therefore he knew you, he knew your family, he understood where you were coming from, and he asked you questions. And because he asked questions, he heard information that gave him wisdom into the situation. When the person kind of walks into the room saying, hey, I'm the expert and I'm going to have a look at your file, and so forth, at the end of the day, that's the person, unfortunately, who makes a mistake. I'll tell you a wonderful story that actually happened with our child, with our daughter, when she was in hospital. And she was in hospital, and they thought that they didn't know exactly what was causing her to have this respiratory distress. So they called in a pediatric a pulmonologist. Very, very respected person. Very respected. And he came along, and he did a few tests and whatever, and he came to the conclusion that he figured that she might well have pneumonia. So he sent her down for x-rays. She comes back from the x-rays, and a couple of hours later he comes to check. He takes a look at the x-rays, and he says, definitely pneumonia, and he prescribes antibiotics. Before the antibiotics arrived, the primary care doctor for the ICU where she was walks into the room, and as he walks into the ward, she was standing up. They had, like these sides, it's almost like a crib, they put up the sides of the bed for little kids so they don't jump off or whatever. He walks in, and she's jumping up and down on the side of the bed, jumping up and down, and like creating chaos. He walks in, he has a look at the x-rays, he has a look at the recommendation and the prescription from the other doctor, and he says to us, does this look like a child with pneumonia to you? She's like jumping up and down with it. Does that look a child? So he said one of the best lines I've ever heard out of a doctor's mouth. He said, give the antibiotic to the x-ray. In other words, wisdom is you've got to hear where people are coming from. Wisdom is a perspective based in humility. Ezehu chacham, not who has acquired wisdom. Who is wise is a person who is humble. How do you know that a person is humble? Because they believe that every single person has something to teach. And that opens the gateway for real wisdom. Because as long as a person believes that they are the expert in a particular field, or that they know more than somebody else, and they close themselves to listen, that's where wisdom dies. Hashem has designed the world in such a way that every single person has a perspective and every single person has value to add, and you never know what value you're going to get from which person and at which time. Therefore, the greatest wisdom is an open mind. The greatest wisdom is humility. The greatest wisdom is the capacity to be able to listen that maybe somebody has something else to teach. And that's David HaMelech's greatness. Because David HaMelech, the Gemara tells us, you look in Tehillim, sometimes he's called Michtam, right? It says Michtam le David. So the Gemara asks, what does Michtam mean? And the Gemara says, Michtam is a composite of two words. The one is the word mach, which means meek, like in English. And the other is tam, which is sincere. And it says that was the greatness of King David, is that even after he became a king, and he sat on the Sanhedrin, and he had such influence, he remained mach and tam. He remained meek, in other words, humble enough to hear what others had to say, and tam, sincere. It's a beautiful insight from one of the commentaries who says, can you imagine sometimes an adult and a child arrive in the same place, right? And they're looking around. How often has this happened? You'll go on an outing with your children, and your children will find something that you would never have noticed, right? It's not always something good, right? The child walks up like a scorpion and says, hey, look what I found, So it's not always necessarily so good. But the fact is, children find things that we don't necessarily find for a simple reason, because they still have curiosity, and they look around, and they're short. One of the reasons is because they're shorter than us, and they're smaller than us. So children sometimes are able to get themselves into spots where they can see things differently. So imagine if you've got a crack in a wall, and the child who's at that height level sees through the crack in the wall, and they say to the parent, hey, look, there's something behind the wall. So now you get two kinds of parent. The one kind of parent says, okay, I'm sure it's very interesting, let's go. And the other parent says, let's look through the crack in the wall. And you look through the crack in the wall, who knows what you find? Could be that the child doesn't begin to understand what actually lies behind the wall, but the parent does. Wow, look at that. I actually think that there's something of value behind that wall. Or perhaps there's another way that we could walk through this hike, or whatever it is. That is exactly what the wise person says. The wise person says, maybe this person is far more simple than I am. It's true. And they know far less than I do. But maybe they notice something that I haven't noticed, that if I look through what they're looking at, maybe I'll be able to bring wisdom out of that. So they don't know how to find the wisdom. They only know how to find the crack in the wall. So they'll ask the question, like the Gemara says, I learn the most from who? Not from my teachers, not even from my colleagues. I learn the most from my students, or in the case of a parent, from my children. So that's the wisdom. The wisdom is to say they could just maybe open up that crack, and through that crack, I'll be able to translate what I'm seeing into something of absolute wisdom. So that's the concept that he's teaching over here. And then he says something else which is also really interesting. He says, the Gemara tells us that before a person is born, there are certain things that are predestined. One of the things that is predestined is whether a person will be intelligent or not intelligent, right? That's what it says. Certain people will be more intelligent than others. You only have to look around. You'll see that some people are just gifted, and other people struggle to understand intellectual things. Comes Ben Zoyma and he says, but that's not fixed in stone. Ezehu chacham. Who is a wise person? Halomed mikol adam. Any person who is open to be able to learn from every single individual, that person can achieve wisdom even if it wasn't predetermined for them. Now that's a fascinating insight, right? When you realize that, to be able to even achieve learning that you perhaps on your own would not have known of, or maybe not even be predetermined for. There's an irony to what Ben Zomer says over here, because of course we know that the more intelligent a person is, the more likely they are to find the faults in others, and that's part of the work over here. The work is that as smart as you are, and as much as you might detect that the other person is lacking in their intelligence, still, if you're truly wise, you'll find a way to learn from them too. Very powerful and beautiful lesson. And very apt, of course, for Ben Zomer himself, because what kind of a person was Ben Zomer? He was the kind of person that at the end of it, they talked about him and said, if you have a dream of Ben Zomer, that in itself is a sign that you are destined for wisdom. Imagine that. And it says that that when Ben Zomer passed away, that was the end. That was the end of all darshanim. People had that powerful wisdom to be able to expound the Torah. So it's quite apt for Ben Zomer to be teaching us this, that here was an individual who lived the principle that he taught. He was incredibly great, he was incredibly wise, and yet he goes down without even his name mentioned, because he was open to learn from every single person. And he says, what's the pasuk? The pasuk says, Eid voisecha, which is a funny word. It's a word that is unique to chapter 119 of Tehillim. The Eid voisecha, with like the pronunciation of the vav. It appears once or twice elsewhere in Tehillim, but it's primarily there. And what he's saying over here is that every single one of us, and this will be a theme that flows right through the whole Mishnah, every single one of us is testimony to the fact that Hashem created us. Every single one of us is testimony to the fact that there is a God. Therefore, every single one of us must have something to teach. What do you think? God made somebody who has no value to add to the world? That would be a horrible perspective. And that fits directly to the final point that he makes. Ezehu mechubad, who is an honorable or honored person, somebody who recognizes that every person has honor. And if you don't, Hashem says, mechabdai achabed. If you honor my creations, you're honoring me. And if you don't, then your boy's eye, you are desecrating or diminishing me. So that's a theme that runs kind of right through. Then he says about Gibor. What's a Gibor? Well, we know that unfortunately there are people out there who are bullies. We know that. And they think that they're strong. And the truth is, they're very far from strong. Any person is a bully, whether it be the classroom bully, or whether it be the bully in business, or whether it be the bully in a community, or whatever the case is. The bully believes that they have strength. The truth is they don't. The truth is they really don't have any strength. All that they've succeeded in doing is they've succeeded in creating a whole lot of people who at some point in time are going to turn against them. And at that point in time, they're going to realize that actually they don't have strength. Because at some point in time, the single bully is going to be stood up by the group of victims. And at that point, the bully becomes very, very weakened. So that's why he wants to be clear to us that at the end of the day, any one of these traits have to be things that are unique to humans. Animals don't have wisdom, but animals do have strength. So therefore, the kind of strength that a human has should not be the same kind of strength as animals have. What is the hierarchy of survival in the wild? The strongest animal survives. Humans shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be like this survival instinct. I'm going to steamroll everybody else in order that I should be able to exist and that I should be able to survive. That's nonsensical, right? That's not good enough. That's not how a human being should behave. So therefore he says the kind of gibor, the kind of strength that a person is supposed to have should not be strength that comes from exerting my power, but rather to be able to control myself. And so what he's telling us over here is something very, very interesting, because what he's saying is, to be able to dominate somebody else only means that that person is weaker. It doesn't mean that you are strong. To be able to dominate yourself, well, of course, the enemy internally is always as strong as you are. So if you really want to find your strength, then the strength that you need is the strength of control of yourself. It's an interesting point, by the way, because the point over here is people believe, and this is alluded to in the pasuk, because what does the pasuk say that he brings? It says two things. First of all, he says, better the person who is patient from the person who is over the person who is strong, and better the person who can control his spirit than the person who can conquer a city. He's telling us two things. First of all, he's telling us there are two stages in any conflict. There is before the conflict happens, and then there's when you have to have the conflict. And that's the unfortunate reality of life. Sometimes you have to have a conflict. Some of us are very conflict averse. We don't like to get into a conflict, but sometimes you have to. Sometimes you got to stand up. You got to say what you believe. So in the first place, the best thing is a person who's patient is better than having to have the conflict and show how strong you are. That's always better. That's why the Gemara tells us that whenever you do have people who are in any kind of a conflict situation, we always try to find peshara. We try to find a way to compromise so that they don't actually have to fight. But if you do have to fight, second part of the pasuk, then Moshe Beruchoi is better than Loiched Ir. When you go into a combat situation, whether that be physically on the battlefield or whether it be, you got to speak something out with somebody, you got to clear the air. It's this time of the year. It's the season of Facebook posts about please forgive me. So this is the time of the year you're supposed to clear the air. So sometimes to clear the air, you got to say, listen, you hurt me. That's why I'm upset. So Moishel Beruchoi, the most important thing is not to conquer the city, not to come out on top, not to be the one who won the argument, rather to be the one who was able to keep myself in a level-headed, healthy, as the Rebbe would often write to people in letters, with appropriate strength that is absolutely, what's the word that he uses? I'm trying to think how to say it in English, but with absolute nimus, with absolute kindness. I don't know if the kindness is the word, but politeness, right? So there's no rough edges. You don't have to hurt anybody in the process. You don't shift your position, but you don't have to hurt anybody in the process. The second message over here is that everybody thinks that they have, and we all go through this experience in our lives, we all think that there are those people who are out there to interfere with our lives. There are those, it could be in business, there's my competition in business. It could be that person who always says remarks that are not comfortable, whatever it is. Every one of us believes that there's somebody out there who we have to contend with, who we have to grapple with. So how am I going to beat them? I have to be stronger than them. Says the Mishnah Ben Zoyma, Moishel Beruchoi, you take care of yourself. You work on yourself, because It's a big enough task, right? To be able to control a person's impulses. You have the strength to look after yourself. Lo yechedir, leave the conquest of the city up to God. He'll take care of that. If you take care of your business, Hashem will take care of the other business that is outside of your control. It's a really good lesson for us to remember. Then he speaks about wealth. Now, what is wealth? Wealth, he says, most people believe that wealth is you want, and you're going to have more. Now, the truth of the matter is, if that is what wealth is, the truth is, then wealth is not me. It's a whole lot of stuff around me. I'm not wealthy. I have wealth. We live in a society today, I can't remember the exact quotation, but Viktor Frankl had a nice quotation about it. He says, we live in a world today that has a very unique kind of angst. What's the unique kind of angst? We have more than any of the previous generations, by any stretch of the imagination. Try and import a Jew from 100 years ago and explain to them why you get frustrated when the internet goes down. Try and explain that that's an issue. Right? Imagine for 1 second trying to complain about the fact that you have so many bedrooms to clean in your house. Imagine explaining this to a Jew from 100 years ago. So why is it that we have the highest levels of anxiety and the highest levels of depression in our society that has the most stuff? Because somewhere along the way, they sold us the story that wealth means the accumulation of things. And Ben Zomer says, wealth, just like again, Chacham is a statement of who you are. You are wise. Gibor is a statement of who you are. You are powerful, not you have overpowered others. Ashir is a question of who you are. Are you a wealthy person? Not do you have wealth that, they'll put you on the Forbes list. Are you a wealthy person? The wealthiest state that a person can ever be in is that I don't need more in my life. I don't need things to make me feel satisfied. That's the ultimate state of wealth. And what he's telling us is, just like a person may be predetermined that they would not be smart, and they can work on that. And a person may be predetermined that they won't be strong, but they could work on that to become internally strong. A person perhaps was predetermined not to be wealthy, but you can work on it to live in a wealthy sense. And there is nobody more wealthy than the person who is wealthy in their mind, because at the end of the day, nobody can take that away from us. There's a little anecdote about Ezehu Chacham, who is wise, the person who learns from everybody else. So there's an anecdote that they say that proves that the only person who ever thinks that they are wise is a fool. Because the wise person knows there's always more to learn. That is wisdom. And that relates to the concept of Chokhmah in mystical terms. Because Chokhmah, the 10 different spheroids, the 10 different dimensions of divine energy, Chokhmah is the energy of bittul, of willingness to let go of ourselves, to be able to be open to something greater than ourselves. That's what he means when he says, who is a Chacham? Somebody who's open to go beyond themselves, to connect to something greater than themselves, even if it lies in the hands of simpler people. Every single person. The next level of the 10 Sephiros is called Bina. Bina is how you consolidate information and you make sure that it is clear, so you understand things thoroughly. Like, for example, the Gemara tells us that Ben Zoyma, his power was drasha, to be able to clarify the meaning of the pasuk, and that, it says, was a strength. He was considered a gibor, he was considered powerful in his Torah learning, because he could consolidate. So the second thing that he talks about is the capacity to be able to consolidate information, to be able to have clarity, and then you'll know how you should behave in any situation, even in a very difficult situation. Da'as, which is the third component, Da'as is real knowledge, not knowledge that is book knowledge, not knowledge of knowing which site to Google in order to find an answer, but knowledge that is part of us, what we call lived values as opposed to stated values. It's what I really, really know. So the Chazal tell us, Ein ani ela beda'as, the only kind of real poverty that ever exists is lack of knowledge. Exactly as Ben Zoyma says, who is really wealthy? Person who's wealthy in their mind. And the last element, the element of kavod, of honor, that relates to the final of the 10 sephiros, which is called Malchus. Malchus is the ability for leadership. And in order to lead, people have to honor you. And the only way that people honor you is if you are somebody who is surrounded by honor. Then it's natural that people will honor you. And how is a person surrounded by honor? When they share honor with other people. When you show everybody else respect, it is only natural that they would show you respect. So I think everybody will agree these are, in fact, 4 universal and fundamental principles. And Rabbi Shimon ben Zoma has done us a tremendous service by helping us to redefine what these 4 are, because we're all looking for them in life, and each one of them has the capacity to make us fuller, more wholesome people.